This is Castle Square, Lincoln, and it's where I started my drawing career many years ago now, sitting here on a Saturday and a Sunday afternoon drawing the west front of Lincoln Cathedral. I started off using technical pens, the sort of pens you can buy in any shop, but gradually I refined my technique and now I use this beautiful Gilliatt dip-in ink pen to do the drawings. Quite a difficult building to draw, even though it is quite symmetrical. You have to look very carefully because there are subtle differences in the way each of the towers are built. You might notice that the southwestern tower, the right-hand tower, is the tower that nearly collapsed about 100 years ago, and the masons had to struggle very hard to save it. And it leans very slightly outwards, so you have to take that into account when you're setting out the drawing and picking out the detail as the sun is shining. Of course, the sun moves around, so the shadows on the west front keep changing. You have to be aware of that. That's one of the difficulties of drawing such a complex building, because the sun moves around during the day and a lot of the subtle shading, the textures in the stonework change. And you get to meet people from all over the world, you know, people I've met here who've gone to America and come back again. People from everywhere, and sometimes, you know, there are language issues, but it's great fun to talk to them. And it reminds me of when I first started. The first time I came out here, I was terrified. I didn't think I'd sell anything, and I thought I might even get arrested. But in actual fact, people were really nice on the first day, and I do remember selling my first drawing. And even now, people are buying my prints, and it's been a really lovely feeling. On the other side. You're going to have me out here every day now, aren't you? I know that. After 2 or 3 years, I felt I needed some guidance and advice because I hadn't learnt to draw very much at art college. So I sent some of my drawings down to Sir Hugh Casson. Now, he was the president of the Royal Academy at that time, and he wrote me back a lovely letter saying he liked my work, and he put me in touch with an artist called Dennis Flanders. Now, Dennis was one of the great topographical artists who used to work for magazines like the London Illustrated News, drawing buildings and landscapes. And he looked at my work and he was very complimentary as well. And he gave me some very useful advice about how to set the drawing out and improve my technique with the pen as well. He used different kinds of pens, but like me, he preferred the old-fashioned crow quill nib, because it gives that subtlety of line when you're drawing. So, and I would always recommend it to other artists if you're just starting up. Go and see a professional, an old timer if you like, who knows all the skills and can give you that sort of advice. That's the best way to go. So what I've tended to do now is to develop the technique of doing sketches and taking photographs of buildings and then going back to the studio and working on them there. There's a lovely example of this from the painter Peter de Wint, who used to live in Lincoln and is famous for his watercolours of the cathedral and other landscapes in the area. Now, he painted one picture which very much impressed me, which is almost exactly this view. And one of the things he does, which is something I do as well, is that he does move the building about slightly. For instance, the central tower, you can see it here. It's actually much, much bigger than these two western towers. But because he didn't want it to dominate the picture, in his watercolour, you can see he has recessed and reduced the size of the central tower, so that the two western towers, the shape of the cathedral, dominate the picture. And he also uses a darker tone to make it appear more in shadow, so that the west front of these two western towers come forward. Using techniques like he would lay on a wash, and then he would actually cut into the wash and take it out of the watercolour again to put highlights in. And he would also use thin layers of white lead paint, highlighting the upright columns of the west front. And it's a magnificent watercolour. I just wish it was on display more, but because of its fading, it's lost a lot of its initial impact. I do the same, except I will probably take photographs as well. In his day, photography was not so flexible. You couldn't just go and do a quick digital grab on your camera. When I've finished the initial drawing, I might look at it and decide that some areas need to be a little bit lighter, a bit more highlighted, and some of the shadow areas need to be darker. And pen and ink, obviously, you can't rub it out in the normal way, but you can do other things to, as it were, dull it down or make it look fainter. The simplest one is chalk, and you can lay chalk onto the paper and rub it in gently, and it immediately makes the background image appear softer, and so you get more three-dimensional quality. Another technique you can use is to, if you really need to, is to dig into the paper and scratch it out with a scalpel knife like this. Sometimes I'll also even use very fine sandpaper, because you can lay the sandpaper on and gently rub the surface and then clean it off with a soft rubber. The problem is though, once you've used sandpaper on the paper surface, you can't draw on it again because you've broken up the surface of the paper and it bleeds when you draw on it. So it's like the afternoon is drawing to a close, and just a question of finishing off the drawing now and then going home for tea. It's wonderful to be able to sell your work directly to people that you've actually created. I'm very lucky to be able to do that. And if people are thinking of being a professional artist or sculptor or craftsperson, it has its troubles and it has its risks and its stresses, but it can be a wonderful life. I've always enjoyed historic buildings because I love history and I love archaeology. And so to be able to draw and visit so many great historic buildings is, it's wonderful. Finding out the history and drawing it and sometimes recreating the building as it used to be. Using the dip pen is like going back in time. I'm using a technique that's been used for at least 200 years. Mr. Gilliot, who invented these pens and was a millionaire at one time because of the success of them, these are the traditional pens that artists would use. They're very sensitive. The harder you press, the thicker the line. So you can get a lot of feeling into the drawing and it looks much more dramatic. These pens you can buy in shops. The drawings look very flat because the line's thickness doesn't vary. It doesn't matter how hard you press, you get the same thickness. Whereas this delicate little pen will give me a lot of sensitivity in the drawing.
Is that for tonal? Is that to give you tonal?
Well, I build up tone through pattern. If you look at some of my drawings of castles, for instance, where you've got quite literally millions of bricks to draw, you can add subtlety by the thickness of, if you like, the mortar between the bricks. So you can build up tone that way. And yeah, you're right, the technique that I use, I tend to use line to create tone. So I get depth in my drawings that way.
What has changed from your early days to drawing now? Is there a change in approach?
Oh yes, there's a change in approach because when I first started, like everybody else, I went to the local art shop and bought these graphic pens, which, as I say, they don't have a difference in thickness of line. You tend to produce rather crude open drawings. But having got used to using these, they're not easy pens to use, these dip pens. But once you get the hang of it and you work at it, like anything else, the more you use these pens, the more subtlety you can get. And that's why I think my drawings, if you look at my early drawings, they're very crude sketches. Now, they're quite fine, detailed drawings.
What makes a great composition? How do you compose your pictures?
That's a really good question because the cathedrals, which are sort of my main subject matter, quite a lot of them now are hidden by buildings. You can see how Exchequer Gate here, the arch, hides the west front of the cathedral. So quite often the drawings I do now have to be thought out. I have to, if you like, imagine how they would look if the buildings in front were taken away. My drawing here, the shadow detail that was on the Exchequer Gate mid-afternoon made the drawing much more three-dimensional, which it's lost it now, it's too flat. And it's very difficult to convey those different subtleties in the architecture in an afternoon sketch, if you like. So yes, my drawings are sometimes said to be photographic, but that's because I want to get across the different kinds of architecture that you find within the building. Lincoln's a wonderful example because it's a great mixture of styles. A building like York Minster, the west front there, is pure Gothic, and so it has more symmetry to it. But nevertheless, there are subtle changes in the upper and lower stories at York. So in my case, I want to get those subtleties across, and it means doing very precise, detailed drawing, which is, as I say, quite difficult sitting out here in the street just one afternoon.
How do you know when you're finished?
You know when you're finished when you look at it and you feel that's what I'm trying to do. I mean, sometimes I've spent 2 weeks on a drawing and it just hasn't worked, and I've had to have the courage and the discipline to literally tear it up and start again and work on it until I feel I've got it right. What we seem to have lost in this country is the kind of tradition of topographical drawing. In the 19th century, there was a profusion of Victorian illustrators who produced great architectural drawings. You can see them in the Royal Institute of British Architects library. Fantastic drawings. And they were the ones that partly inspired me, actually. So it's been lovely coming out here again and drawing Lincoln Cathedral. Thank you.